What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Clair Obscur Expedition 33, a sort of Western JRPG drenched in surrealism, interesting combat mechanics, and a really great story about family and grief. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements and also includes a lot more than that, there's a video linked below that will cover everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. In the case of this game, as I am bringing you this review about one day before its official release, it's probably pretty obvious then that I received a review key for this. In fact, I received it all the way back at the beginning of April, so I had this game for quite some time, and thus I was able to pretty comfortably get this done. What's more, before that even, I had also participated in an early preview where they basically just gave you access to a build to check out. And from that preview, my main takeaway was simply that I think whether or not you enjoy this game, a lot or a little, basically comes down to how much you wind up enjoying the combat, that would be pretty make or break for people. And while I think this game does have more going on than that, that is definitely something that was reaffirmed throughout my time with the game. And we'll get into that, obviously. But before we do, just a note on spoilers, we are a day ahead of the game's official release here, and this game has a pretty big emphasis on its story. There's some huge twists and reveals, and obviously I don't really want to go into any of that or spoil that for anybody. So while I'm not really going to talk about these things, there might be some contextual stuff in the footage that I'm going to try to avoid showing, but due to the sort of nature of those reveals and changes that happen throughout the game, it's actually kind of hard not to show them, because of how it affects things, just like menus as an example. So because of that, you may just want to listen instead of watch this. From there, let's talk a little bit about the game itself. So as I mentioned, great story about family and grief, as this takes place in a world where the Paintress, a large mysterious figure far away near a monolith, will once a year rise up, paint a descending number onto a monolith, and then everyone that age or above kind of just disintegrates and fades away. And so the people of this area have been sending out expeditions in order to, do something about this. And then unsurprisingly, we are playing as Expedition 33. And while this game has some fun combat, I wanted to say that right at the beginning here, because the game touches a lot on themes of, again, loss and grief and how they can overwhelm a person, how people cope with those things, etc. And it winds up going some pretty dark places, but if you're willing to follow through with it, it really is a fantastic story. And I think that might get a little undersold thanks to things just like the interesting combat mechanics and the surrealism in the art. Now, I say combat's probably going to be make or break for this, mostly because it comes down a lot to QTEs, and with my experience with this game, difficulty that says it reduces the need to rely on those things, I found to not have that crazy of an effect on them. So when enemies attack you, you'll have to try to dodge or parry to mitigate damage. In fact, you can just no-hit bosses and everything if you manage to do this well. Now, there's not much you can do about that. That just is the combat mechanics. Now, on the flip side, when you attack enemies, there are sometimes little QTEs to perform extra effects or damage, and in some extreme cases, even avoid damage to yourself or failing the attack at all. In the options, you can set those to auto sort of work, so you don't have to worry about those, but the incoming stuff isn't a negotiable aspect of this game. And as I mentioned, while the difficulty options say it's going to reduce the reliance on this, after playing around with all three difficulties, which you can freely change, I found that to not really be true in most cases, especially for the optional stuff. Maybe it's true for the critical path, which is frankly a bit easier than some of the optional in-game things, because with that stuff, frankly, those enemies and bosses will one-shot you if you miss those things on any difficulty you're playing on. So much so that I actually wouldn't be surprised if this winds up getting a balance pass, because I literally couldn't tell you the difference between most of those. But from there, let's talk the technical state. I had this game for a while. How was it running? So two things I wanted to note here are primarily that, unfortunately, I did have a lot of crashes. Over roughly 60 hours with this game, it crashed at least a dozen times. I kind of just stopped counting after a little while. I always do a little bit of research into the why when that kind of thing happens, and I could not track down a specific cause, at least on my own. Sometimes problems with drivers will cause that sort of thing, especially with review copies. And with this being ahead of the official release, I don't know how it's going to run for everybody else, but again, left a bit to be desired there. Now, what's more, in this section of the video, I actually wanted to mention that the game does feature quite a few options to, again, customize little stuff like, do you want to be affected by QTs on your abilities, stuff like that, and it may be worth engaging with that stuff to kind of figure out if this is up your alley, so to speak, or if that would be something you want. But moving on from there, let's talk about difficulty. So my main thing about difficulty that I already mentioned is that I felt little difference between them because of how the active elements of combat work. But we do have 3 options, essentially easy, normal, hard, and what they are supposed to do is affect enemy damage and then how easy those dodge and parries are to pull off. But to reiterate, I felt very little difference between any of these, not least of which because it is pretty easy overall to deal with the sort of critical path through the story, either by just over-leveling or grinding, as with many JRPGs, which is going to eliminate most of the difficulty there, especially once the game opens up and you can kind of do everything before the sort of end scene. But when it comes to the optional stuff like the super bosses, in-game optional encounters, stuff like that, a lot of those guys have abilities that are basically one-shots if you miss the dodge or the parry or anything like that. And as a result of that being on every single difficulty, it really just reinforced my feeling that if you don't enjoy this type of combat, you're probably just not going to enjoy this game. But if you like it, it's a pretty great time. That brings me to the story setup and my thoughts on that. So again, going to try to avoid spoilers here, not going in depth on a lot of this simply because of the fact that we're ahead of the release date, and it's also a really good story that I want people to experience. But again, we are playing as Expedition 33, embarking on a quest to do something about the paintress painting numbers on a monolith, resulting in the death of everybody above that age. This has been going on for roughly 67 years at the time of the beginning of the game, and the story is frankly all about that journey, but not only that journey, but also asking questions like, why is this happening? What is this all about? Who all of these people are? And then it also deals with heavy themes surrounding things like grief and loss and just, family dealing with those things. As right at the start of the game, you see that every year when this event happens and it takes the people of those new numbers, they experience that all over again, especially in town, and it's obviously dominated their society as that age gets lower and lower, and getting the opportunity to see both of the sort of zoomed out version of all that stuff, but then how it relates to individual characters that are affected by all this, which you can witness at camp cutscenes with the playable characters will be involved in, makes for some really touching moments, in my opinion. Now, I'll go over the individual characters in the combat section. I don't want to get into it too much here because, again, I don't want to spoil their narrative arcs. So I'll simply say that the only one I wound up disliking was Minoko, the sort of comedic relief gestural, which are these kind of like humanoid paintbrushes that love to fight everything. He honestly felt a little forced, but the rest of it was a really good time. From there, though, let's talk progression system. So this is something this game has quite a few of, everything from individual character progression, exploration progression via our sort of secondary companion named Esqui, who winds up being this game's equivalent of an airship towards the end, but can also swim and simply get you through land barriers at the same time. But let's focus on individual characters. So every character has the level ups associated with typical RPGs like this. As usual, as they level up, their base stats increase, making them stronger simply by being a higher level. In addition to that, though, we also gain skills and attributes every level. At the game's various checkpoints is where we'll be able to increase these, but we get 1 skill point per level, and as those accumulate, we can buy new skills to use in combat once we have action points, and then we also get 3 attributes. You can put these in anything you want, really. But it's important to note that the weapons, which are your main bit of equipment that you'll assign to each character, also scale off of different attributes. So what I found to be the most effective was to give everybody at least a little vitality to help them survive, and then focus kind of all in on might and whatever their weapons are scaling off of after that. You will ultimately have enough attribute points to max out about 3 of these, give or take, so you got plenty of room to mess around with, and for the most part they simply increase the secondary stats that you can see to the right there. Now, weapons are interesting because they often have a damage type associated with them, typically physical or then some other element. Some skills work off of whatever element your weapon is, and then obviously your base attacks take that into account, which is especially important because enemies have resistances and weaknesses, meaning that if you want to optimize, you'll probably want to be switching out weapons every so often, which requires keeping them leveled up. Your weapons also can be upgraded. They have their base level you find them at, and if you find duplicates, it always overwrites it to the highest level you've found. But upgrading these with various upgrade materials you can find around, first at the curator, who will show up in your camp, and then later on you can actually just do it at the checkpoints. And this will of course just increase how effective that weapon is, requiring more and more resources as you go, up to a maximum of 33 if you'd believe it. But because of the fact that you might want to switch these out on occasion, you may want to upgrade various weapons for various situations, as honestly you will probably wind up with more upgrade materials than you need if you're properly exploring. But then there's the other major progression system, which is Pictos and Lumina. So Pictos are effectively like equipable accessories. They all have stats and an effect associated with them. When you have Pictos equipped, once you partake in 4 battles with them equipped, you then learn the special effect associated with that Picto, which is known as a Lumina. Lumina can then be equipped for all of your characters at that point. So you only need to learn them once per character, and then all of your characters can learn them at that point. Every time your character levels up, they also gain 1 Lumina point, and then there is an item called Color of Lumina that you can use to upgrade the overall capacity for any individual character. Personally, I found about 250 to 300 points per character at a max level to be where I could make a really strong setup for them. But basically we spend these Lumina points then to equip all of the effects from these Pictos, and that in combination with the other stuff makes that character's sort of build for you. Now the somewhat catch to this is you have to remember that the actual Pictos you equip do have stats associated with them, so sometimes you'll want to equip certain Pictos because of those stats as well, and then have other stuff filled out via the Lumina list, but obviously the minutia of that is going to be up to you. Just something to note for sure, though obviously the most valuable stuff comes in the late game, which is things that let you break the initial damage limit of 9,999, or the ability to just grant your character 2 turns in a row, which is going to help you dominate just via action economy, which by the way is essentially required for the optional late game stuff. Now, other than all that, there's just one more minor system I want to mention, and that is the potions. So, we get various potions and elixirs to carry with us to use in combat between rests at checkpoints, which are going to allow us to either full heal our party, or heal, give action points, or revive characters in combat. We start out with 1 each of these, but you can find charges of them as you explore, which will increase the amount of times you can do this in between actual rests. That brings us to gameplay and world. Now, for the most part, I would say if you've ever played a JRPG, you'll probably feel right at home in terms of how this game actually plays from that perspective. That is to say, we have an overworld system where we'll run around, have encounters, even find items and secrets as usual, but that overworld map allows you to enter various locations. Worth a mention that areas far beyond your level will be marked as danger on the world map, and for the most part I actually found that little message to be super accurate. It was usually worthwhile to level up until that little disclaimer fell off, and then at that point I was pretty much good to go every single time. Now as you're moving through the story, it will mark the locations that you need to head on your map, as the world map is a pretty decent size and it's easy to get a little turned around, but luckily that little quality of life feature will keep you on track and you can just focus on the critical path if you want. But there is a whole host of optional stuff. Now, as you explore that world map, you can find shortcuts for traversal, especially when you are initially landlocked before you get access to Esqui. And through these shortcuts, you can just make paths over like mountains and stuff, which makes getting around a little bit easier. And then once you actually get access to Esqui, it can destroy blocks and stuff in your way, allowing you to get into places you couldn't before you can then swim and fly later. So there's all that. But let's talk about the individual levels when we're on foot exploring a given area. So this is where the game, in addition to things like the attributes, I would say definitely takes some notes from Souls-like in terms of level design. Not so much combat really, but in terms of their level design, you can definitely kind of see the influence there. That is to say, we see things like checkpoints where we can rest to respawn enemies if you're interested in grinding up some levels, or you just want to knock out your Pictos or something. And this is also where you'll level up, refuel and whatnot before going on about the level. And then as you do that, you can also unlock shortcuts to more quickly traverse through a given area that stay active in between rests and everything. So functionally speaking, you can definitely see where they got some of those ideas from. But as you can no doubt see as we move through a given area, a pretty big aspect to exploration is just the sort of surrealism happening in the background, seeing all of these creatures that have been painted into existence known as Nevrons, whose sole purpose seems to be wiping people out that they come across in order to maintain some sort of order. unbeknownst to you when you initially encounter them, forming a sort of background mystery that you can also somewhat investigate, because occasionally some of these guys will be friendly and offer short little side quests where you can get some more information, which is often how you can uncover secrets and just optional content in general. And then simply as part of the main story, you'll also learn about all sorts of things like the Gestrals, the somewhat peaceful sort of humanoid paintbrush guys that I mentioned who love to fight everything that moves. Now, these guys aren't exactly an inherent danger, but through their love to fight, they may wind up injuring people unintentionally, and we kind of see that reflected through certain bits of the game. So these guys aren't exactly safe to be around, but they're not actively trying to cause you a problem either, which is also something you can see in the form of their merchants, who typically all have a sort of secret inventory that you have to fight the merchant in a solo fight to unlock, and you can even find them doing stuff like setting up bouts of various games that they like to play on locations throughout the world map, typically beach locations. And this is where you can even see some like platforming type sections. And to be fair, the game, while offering up a lot of this platforming here or there, I also don't think has the precision of movement required to fully implement systems like that. So I didn't exactly love these little platforming sections, but they are in there. And all of that kind of stuff is what you can expect to see from Expedition 33. And I think they do a fantastic job of really leaning into that sort of whimsical surrealism that is the art style that is obviously inspired by some French themes, which are especially prevalent in places where there's a little more civilization. But before we wrap up this section, I did want to mention the game's camp system. When you're out on the overworld, you can sort of retire to camp, which is where you'll have a chance to talk to your companions, which actually leads into a small other progression system, which is your relationship level with those companions, which at a certain point in the game can be raised, which gives you access to their sort of limit breaks called a gradient attack, and increasing that relationship is how you unlock the better versions of those things. And you're going to handle all of that stuff in camp. And this can even lead to a few other side quests for your companions, and it's where you'll get a lot of their backstory, find out what they're all about, etc. And I think that's a pretty well done thing. And this is also where you'll have the option, if you want to reflect on your journey by writing in your own expedition journal. But for the most part, I would say the camp is primarily a place to host various story beats that they want to hit. From there, let's talk combat. The part that I think is going to be make or break for a lot of people, because it is primarily a turn-based system, but has certain active elements, such as quick time events, unsurprisingly, but also things like just timing dodges and parries out of the way of enemies to avoid damage entirely, potentially leading to counterattacks and the like, but also the ability to free aim and target enemy weak points, potentially for big damage, or just disrupting certain effects. As an example of that specific system, there's actually an optional boss that will shine some lights in a specific pattern, and if you don't disrupt those with free aim ranged attacks in that order, it will unleash a devastating hit that is very hard to counterattack. Now, the turn-based elements of this are really straightforward. When it's your character's turn, based on their speed stat, which determines how often they can move, they can perform the actions available to them, which are pretty much basic attack, use a skill, or free aim, or use an item. Skills are typically better than base attacks, but not always, because they will often have extra effects associated with them, and they almost always play into a given character's sort of play style, and we'll get into those in a moment, but each playable character has a sort of different mechanic that sets them apart from the others. Now, in order to use skills, though, we first need action points. There's a few ways to get more of that, often dictated by the various bits of lumina that you have equipped, but basically every turn and every time you attack, you will at the very least gain action points that way, and then you can also do it when you dodge or parry based on what you've got in terms of lumina. But lumina, even on this basic stuff, has really big effects. For instance, there is lumina that will give you extra attacks, extra action points. In fact, if you defeat an optional boss relatively early into the optional in-game stuff, you'll get one that just straight up gives you a second turn, which is massive for the late game. Now, other aspects to this, though, are shields and breaks. So everyone has access to a shield mechanic. Basically, these are armor points you can throw on your characters or enemies will throw on themselves, and each shield fully deflects one attack. It won't do anything, and you'll have to chew through them. That's actually something that like free aim shots are good for, because free aim shots cost action points to perform, which means you can actually use free aim ranged attacks to target weak points or just break through shields, as an example, up to the point at which you just don't have any more action points, at which point you could say basic attack as an example, which fully buffed up in the late game is actually a surprisingly effective strategy. and in some cases will even outdamage your skills and abilities, though not always. Now, as we're doing all of that, though, on plenty of enemies, this will build up a sort of stun meter. When that stun meter is full, it doesn't automatically stun the target, but rather you need to use an ability or attack that has a break effect, which will then fully break them and then stun them or perform some other effect in certain fights. For instance, there are these weird mimes you can encounter, and oftentimes they will just have massively reduced incoming damage until you break them, but only some attacks and abilities actually do this. Now, there is a Lumina that makes your basic attacks break enemies, which I found super helpful, by the way, because a lot of the skills I liked to use did not have that break effect. But then let's get into the dodging and parrying. So when enemies attack you, it is actually very possible to take 0 damage from an encounter. We're going to do this by dodging and parrying. Enemies will often attack in combos or just various things like that, and a lot of times what you're going to have to figure out is whether you want to dodge or parry or what you need to do in that situation. Dodging is easier, but it does just that. It just dodges out of the way and prevents you from taking damage. Parries are more difficult and require more precise timing, but if you can parry every attack in an enemy's combo or a just general attack sequence, skill, or whatever else, you can then perform a counter attack on them, which will typically do a massive hit, increase their stun gauge, and obviously negate damage from you at the same time. Some enemies are more susceptible to this than others, but if you can master counter-attacking on top of having a really good build, you can trivialize most fights, even some of the optional in-game super bosses. In fact, I would say it's basically required for the 2 bosses that I would consider super bosses that I ran into, as one of them heals themselves non-stops if you don't manage to pull this off, and the other one basically one-shots you if you fail. Now from there, I want to talk about the individual characters we can use in combat and what their unique elements are. So there are ultimately 6 playable characters. We have Gustav. He has a sort of charge mechanic. So he has a mechanical arm, and as he hits enemies in combat with his abilities and stuff, it builds up charge. Depending on the level of charge, you can then use his ability Overcharge to unleash that, which will deal massive damage. And it can even break enemies as well. Next up, we've got Lune, a sort of spellcaster. She has a lot of magical abilities and can also be your healer if you want, depending on how you want to mess around with her skills. But her mechanic is all about building up stains. So each of her abilities both generates and consumes stains. Certain abilities of hers are then empowered by the types of stains consumed, potentially leading to extra effects and the like. Which means, ideally, there's like a certain order you'll want to cast stuff in to get the most out of any individual spell, which is where she really shines. Following that, though, we then have Mayel. Mayel is all about stances. So each of her various abilities will alternate her stance from either just stanceless or defensive, offensive, or virtuoso. So defensive obviously reduces incoming damage, offensive increases it, and then virtuose actually increases it massively by like 200%. And typically the stuff that puts her in that stance requires some more specific effects. The easiest one I found was one that puts that stance on you when you attack a burning enemy, which is a relatively easy status effect to put on an enemy. In that way I could reliably trigger it before using her big abilities like Sword Ballet. I will say that she is one of the characters that benefits massively from a second turn, which you can get in the later game really easily, and this is because of the way that stance system works. So you can use the first turn to set up the stance, and then the second turn to actually execute the ability with the stance you just set up, because she's an incredible damage dealer if you can manage to set that up properly. Next is Sayel. So she will put foretell on enemies with a lot of her attacks. This allows her to just basically apply stacks of an ability, which then also generates charges, and then her consume abilities will typically provide the opposite mark, so sun versus moon, and also consume the foretell stacks. But when she has both sun and moon marks from using these abilities, it then puts her into Twilight State based on the number of those marks that she has. And Twilight State massively increases her damage, but also allows her to stack more foretell on enemies to set up for a potentially massive attack in a way that is not all that dissimilar from somebody like, say, Mayel. And then last but not least, we have Minoko. Minoko is actually, I would say, the most unique because he uses that trope of stealing enemies' abilities from them. So as we fight Nevron's Minoko, if he's in your party, will then steal their feet, which apparently gives him access to the skills they use, and that's how he gathers his abilities. So his whole progression system actually works a little differently because he does not get a skill tree, he gets these. On top of that though, he also has a beast wheel. Basically everything he does spins a wheel so many turns, and then whatever it lands on will empower certain types of his abilities, as they are all sort of divided up into various categories. So all of that's pretty neat. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, each of these characters also has a form of limit break called a gradient attack. They'll get the base one once you get access to them generally, but then as your relationship with each of them increases, you get access to level 2 and 3. As you attack enemies, typically with skills, but with Lumina you do have some other options later in terms of building it up, but you ultimately build your gradient bar in combat, and then depending on the level it's at, 1, 2, or 3, you get to use those gradient attacks. Now it's probably worth a mention though that if you have a full level 3 gradient bar and you only use a level 1 attack, you get to keep those other 2 bars. It does build sort of collectively as combat goes on, and some of the level 3 ones are devastating. In fact, Mael's was a real lifesaver in terms of some of the in-game battles. But before we wrap up this section, just as a little bit of a reminder, the reason I think whether you like this game or not is going to come down to this combat system is because there's not really a lot of ways to avoid this system. It's obviously a huge part of the game, but again, even the difficulty part outside of the critical path, which is relatively easy anyway due to the way the level scaling works, a lot of the side stuff, the optional content, etc., if you fail these QTEs or the dodges or the parries, you just die. Doesn't actually matter what the difficulty is on. And especially in the optional encounters where enemies can just do that repeatedly before you get a chance to attack, which is why the extra turns on your characters are so important, it's very possible they'll wipe out your entire party before you even have a chance to do anything. So it winds up being a case of if you enjoy that, or you can sort of learn to find ways to enjoy it, it's a great time, but if it's not your cup of tea, it's just not something you're going to have a good time with for sure. Now, if you do enjoy this combat, you can actually take it a little further even than just expert mode though, because the game does feature a New Game Plus mode that will actually increase the difficulty of encounters and everything, offering some potentially exclusive loot along the way, letting you continue the journey after you finish it up the first time. So if you enjoy that combat system, you can even double down on it and take it further, though seeing how you can do everything in essentially one playthrough, I don't think it's like wildly necessary or anything, but the option is certainly there for you. Which brings us to the Steam Deck section. So officially speaking, the Steam Deck is unsupported, though I don't entirely agree with that because you can in fact get Clair Obscur running on the Steam Deck, and you can get it running at a decent frame rate, like 30 to 40 FPS. And while that is on low settings, it mostly seems to be fine. I'm genuinely not sure why this was given an unsupported versus playable rating, but you know, there may very well be something behind the scenes that I don't know. But that's simply at the time of this review because the devs have mentioned that they plan on optimizing for the Steam Deck as in the post-launch period of the game, so in theory that should get better, which is obviously for the best because I think this genre tends to play really well on handheld devices anyway. But with cloud support, controller support, all that stuff, I again just don't see why this wasn't given a rating of playable. You might have to mess around with the settings a bit to get a decent frame rate, but other than that I really don't see what the issue is. Which brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, for me it was really the story, the art style, and honestly the battle system. So, the story, just again about loss, grief, dealing with those things, how people cope with them. And while it's relatively minimal, you also have some choices in there yourself, but again, don't want to spoil anything. And I just really enjoyed what they had to show there. The art, I think, speaks for itself. I just really love the art style of this one, and then the battle system. So I realize this won't be for everybody, but for me, I had a great time with it. I enjoyed those more reactive elements, and while this is certainly not the first game I've ever seen do that, in fact, I would say it's decently common, actually, for turn-based games to try to incorporate more active elements into them to make them more interesting. For instance, the active dodging and blocking or QTEs on your attacks to make them stronger are not new in any way. But nonetheless, I do like how they feel in terms of the gameplay context of this game. I think they did a good job with that if it's your cup of tea. Now, on the negative side of things, while I don't think this is a terribly difficult game by any standard, I would be surprised if the difficulty options don't wind up getting some sort of balance pass, just because, again, after trying all of them, I noticed that there was almost no difference, at least to me. because of how the combat mechanics work and everything in the late game. There just wasn't much difference there, which might be different for the critical path, but it's just a little bit of an oddity I wanted to point out. Beyond that though, mostly just minor stuff. Some quality of life things would have been nice. For instance, the world map is pretty big, and the locations that will show on the world map don't do a great job of telling you where you have and haven't been, because while they won't display their name if you haven't entered them, when you're looking at the entire world map zoomed out, you can't see the names of these places anyway, which makes checking to make sure you didn't miss a location or anything really annoying. And I wouldn't have hated some sort of in-game system of properly tracking things you were trying to do, like some of the game's various side quests and secrets, but seeing how that's not exactly common for JRPGs anyway, it's not exactly a big deal. So for the most part, I would say minor quibbles in terms of negatives, at least for me. Which then brings me to my conclusion. So, as I've stated many times, I think whether or not most people enjoy this game will come down to how much you like this combat system. But discounting that, I think Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a beautiful game, both in terms of its narrative, its art style. I personally had a lot of fun with the combat. And then, for the price of $50 US is what the game is launching for on Steam, but they do have a bit of a launch discount over there that's like $5 off, I think, so it might be a little less than that for some people. But that, in combination with its release on Game Pass, which is obviously substantially less than that, if this game even looks remotely interesting to you, I think it's well worth the money, and I had a great time with it, which is obviously then where we're going to wrap up this video. So, certainly hope you enjoyed all that. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.